1923, the city of Vienna was printing its own money. So was Munich. Hamburg had its own currency. Cologne issued scrip. Across Germany and Austria, cities, towns, and even private companies were producing paper notes because the national currencies had collapsed. The Weimar Republic's mark and the Austrian crown were disintegrating so rapidly that by the time wages were printed, they were worthless. So local governments bypassed the center and created emergency money, not Geld, they called it, necessity money. These notes were often beautiful, printed on linen, illustrated with local landmarks, historical scenes, medieval knights, folkloric imagery. Collectors prize them today, but at the time, they were desperate measures. A city printing its own currency is not a sign of autonomy. It is a sign that the national system has failed. When every city prints its own money, the country itself becomes a patchwork of isolated economies, each one struggling to survive the collapse of the whole. The phenomenon was not unique to Weimar Germany. This happened repeatedly across history. Whenever central authority disintegrates and national currency becomes unreliable, local regions fracture financially. They issue their own money to keep trade alive. But this fragmentation accelerates collapse, because once trust in the center breaks, the periphery cannot hold. The empire does not fall to invasion. It falls to 1,000 small secessions, each one printing paper that no one else accepts. The Roman Empire in the 3rd century experienced this. As the silver content of the denarius declined, regional mints began producing their own coins with varying purity. A denarius minted in Rome might contain 5% silver. One from Antioch might have 3%. One from Gaul might have 7%. Merchants stopped trusting coins based on imperial stamps. They weighed them, they tested them, and eventually they refused coins from distant regions entirely. The empire fractured economically long before it fractured politically. By the time the Western Empire officially fell in 476, it had already been dead for generations, splintered into local economies that no longer spoke the same monetary language. Medieval Europe, after the Carolingian Empire, followed the same pattern. Charlemagne had established a standardized silver penny across his realm. But after his death in 814, the empire fragmented. Each successor kingdom, then each duchy, then each city, began minting its own version of the penny. By the 12th century, hundreds of different coins circulated across Europe, each one claiming to be a legitimate penny but containing wildly different amounts of silver. Trade became a nightmare. Every transaction required money changers. Every journey across borders involved currency exchange at punishing rates. The monetary fragmentation reinforced political fragmentation. Europe would not have a unified currency again for 800 years. China, during the late Ming dynasty in the early 17th century, experienced a version of this. The dynasty had issued paper money, the BOCHO, but chronic overprinting destroyed its value. By the 1500s, people refused it. The government tried to force acceptance through law, punishing merchants who rejected the notes. It did not work. Commerce reverted to silver and barter. Regional economies began using localized forms of money, often private notes issued by merchant guilds or wealthy families. The central government lost the ability to collect taxes effectively because the money it demanded was worthless, and the money people actually used was outside its control. The Ming dynasty collapsed in 1644, undermined by many factors, but the disintegration of its monetary system was one of them. A government that cannot control its currency cannot govern. The Weimar Republic is the most studied case of monetary fragmentation, but it is rarely analyzed through this lens. Most accounts focus on hyperinflation, the famous images of people carrying wheelbarrows full of cash to buy bread, but hyperinflation is the symptom. The fragmentation is the disease. By 1923, Germany was not one economy, it was thousands. Each city operated semi-independently. Wages were paid in local scrip. Prices were quoted in foreign currency or in goods. Barter became common. The national currency still existed in name, but it no longer functioned as money. It was paper with numbers that changed by the hour. This collapse began years earlier. After World War I, the Treaty of Versailles imposed reparations on Germany that the country could not pay through taxation. The government borrowed, but lenders lost confidence. So Germany printed money to cover obligations. At first, the inflation was moderate. Prices rose, but wages adjusted. Workers demanded higher pay. Employers, able to borrow cheaply from a central bank that printed without limit, agreed. For a brief period, the economy seemed almost functional. Unemployment was low. Factories ran. Trade continued. But the printing accelerated. By 1922, prices were rising daily. By mid-1923, they rose hourly. The mark lost value so fast that workers demanded to be paid twice a day so they could spend the money before it became worthless. Shops stopped posting prices because they could not update signs quickly enough. Transactions reverted to barter or foreign currency, primarily the US dollar. The dollar became the de facto currency of Germany, but only for those who had access to it. For everyone else, local scrip was the only option. Cities issued their own notes, backed by local tax revenue or municipal assets. Some were stable for weeks. Others collapsed within days. The scrip from one city was rarely accepted in another. Travel became nearly impossible. A worker in Hamburg could not easily move to Berlin because his savings, denominated in Hamburg scrip, were worthless there. The country had fractured economically into isolated islands. The hyperinflation ended in November 1923 when the government introduced the Rentenmark, a new currency backed by real estate and industrial assets. The Rentenmark stabilized almost immediately, not because of its backing, which was largely theoretical, but because people wanted to believe in something. The old mark was declared worthless. Savings denominated in marks evaporated. Pensions disappeared. Anyone holding cash lost everything. But the economy could function again because there was once more a single currency that everyone accepted. The cost of the stabilization was borne entirely by the population. The government effectively defaulted on all domestic obligations by rendering the old currency worthless. Bondholders, savers, pensioners, all were wiped out. The wealthy, who had converted assets into foreign currency or real property, survived. The middle class was destroyed. The political resentment from this wealth destruction would poison Germany for the next decade, feeding extremism and rage that culminated in 1933. Argentina in the late 20th century repeated this cycle multiple times. The peso collapsed in the 1970s. The government introduced the peso argentino in 1983. It collapsed. The austral was introduced in 1985. It collapsed. The peso was reintroduced in 1992, this time pegged to the dollar. The peg held for a decade, then collapsed in 2001. During each collapse, provincial governments issued their own currencies. Patacons in Buenos Aires, La Cops nationally, Federales in other provinces. At one point, Argentina had a dozen different pseudo-currencies circulating simultaneously. Each provincial currency was a claim on future tax revenue. The provinces issued them to pay employees and suppliers when they ran out of pesos. Workers accepted them because they had no choice, but the notes were discounted immediately. A patacon with a face value of 1 peso might trade for 70 cents in actual pesos, and the discount varied by province. A note from a wealthy province traded closer to par. A note from a poor province might be worth 50 cents or less. Argentina had fractured into monetary fiefdoms. The federal government eventually ended the experiment by banning provincial currencies and forcing provinces to honor their obligations in pesos. But the damage was done. Trust in the national currency was shattered. Argentines hoarded dollars. Banks froze accounts to prevent runs. The economy collapsed into one of the worst recessions in the country's history. The monetary fragmentation had made the crisis worse, not better. Yugoslavia in the 1990s experienced something even more extreme. As the country disintegrated into civil war, each breakaway republic issued its own currency. The Yugoslav dinar continued to exist in Serbia, but it hyperinflated faster than Weimar. Croatia introduced the kuna, Slovenia the tolar. Bosnia used multiple currencies simultaneously, sometimes different ones in different cities. Prices were quoted in Deutschmarks because no one trusted local paper. The Serbian dinar reached inflation rates that made Weimar look stable. In January 1994, prices doubled every 16 hours. That is faster than any hyperinflation ever recorded. People stopped using cash entirely. They bartered, traded in cigarettes, or used foreign currency if they could get it. The dinar existed, but it was not money. It was confetti. And the government kept printing it anyway, because printing was the only way to pay soldiers and bureaucrats. The war and the monetary collapse fed each other. The state could not stop printing without collapsing, but printing guaranteed collapse. There was no exit. When the war ended, the dinar was replaced by a new currency, and the cycle began again. But the population had learned. Every subsequent crisis saw immediate flight to foreign currency. The memory of hyperinflation and monetary fragmentation became embedded in the culture. Yugoslavs and later Serbs would never fully trust their national currency again. The pattern across all these cases is the same. The central government loses control of money. Local authorities step in to fill the void. This provides short-term relief, but accelerates long-term disintegration. Because once the country fractures monetarily, it cannot easily reunify. Each region develops its own interests. Each currency creates a constituency that benefits from its continued existence. And reintegration requires forcing those constituencies to accept losses. The political cost is enormous. This is why monetary fragmentation is one of the most dangerous symptoms of state collapse. It is worse than inflation alone. Inflation is centralized. It can be stopped by a central authority with the will to act. But fragmentation is decentralized. It requires coordinating dozens or hundreds of issuers, each one with its own incentives and pressures. Stopping it requires either authoritarian force or complete economic collapse and restart. The city that prints its own currency is trying to survive. But survival in isolation is not victory. It is the beginning of irrelevance. Because a city with its own money cannot trade easily with other cities, it cannot attract investment, cannot integrate into larger markets, becomes an island. And islands, no matter how well managed, are always weaker than continents. Germany in 1923 was not one economy printing too much money. It was 1,000 economies, each one printing printing separately, each one hoping to outlast the collapse of the center. But the center did not return until all the local currencies were destroyed. The Rentenmark worked not because it was well designed, but because everyone was exhausted. The fragmentation had become unbearable. People wanted unification, even at the cost of their savings. This exhaustion is how monetary crises end. Not through rational policy, but through the population's desperation for stability. By the time the stabilization comes, the wealth destruction is total. The middle class is gone, the savers are ruined, and the new currency starts from zero, built on the ashes of the old system and the fortunes of everyone who held paper. The local currencies, the Notgeld and Patacones and provincial scrip, are remembered today as curiosities, colorful relics of chaotic times, but they were not quaint. They were the death throes of national economies. Each one represented a failure of central authority. Each one deepened the fracture. Each one brought the final collapse closer. The city that printed its own currency was trying to save itself, but it was also writing its own defeat. Because the moment a city decides it cannot trust the national money, the nation is already gone. And once the nation is gone, the city cannot stand alone. The printing press runs. The notes accumulate. The value drains away. And in the end, the paper is worthless, the city is bankrupt, and the country is a memory. Monetary fragmentation does not preserve, disintegrates, and the regions that fragment first are the ones that suffer longest. Because they break away before the collapse is complete, which means they must endure both the national crisis and their own local crisis simultaneously. They print to survive today, and by printing, they ensure they cannot survive tomorrow. The lesson is cold. Monetary sovereignty belongs to the center or to no one. Shared currencies work when trust is high. Local currencies work when regions are isolated. But mixed systems, where some use one money and some use another, work for no one. They create friction, distrust, and collapse. The effort to print locally in a national crisis is rational, but rationality at the local level produces catastrophe at the national level. Weimar Germany stabilized only when local currencies were banned. Argentina stabilized only when provincial money was outlawed. Yugoslavia stabilized only when the wars ended and new currencies replaced the fragments. In every case, the path back required destroying the local solutions that had kept people alive during the crisis. The price of reunification was the obliteration of the mechanisms that had provided temporary relief. This is the trap. You cannot survive the collapse without fragmenting, but you cannot rebuild without reunifying. And reunification requires accepting losses that the population, having already suffered through fragmentation, cannot bear. So the collapse deepens, the currency fractures further, and the only resolution is exhaustion. The city prints, the nation dies, and the paper, no matter how beautiful the engraving, becomes a historical artifact of a country that no longer exists.